She gave a rancher shelter. By morning, she was forced to marry him or be accused of sin Evelyn. Carter lived in a quiet, lonely corner of the Texas countryside, where the dry wind carried whispers instead of words, and silence was a companion more faithful than any man. At 28 years old, she had become a fixture in the community, not because of her presence, but precisely because of her absence. Her parents had died within months of each other 3 years earlier, leaving her the family's modest ranch and a life that no longer had voices to fill the rooms. The Carters had once been admired in town, known for their generosity and unshakable principles. Evelyn had inherited not just the land, but also their reputation, along with the burden of maintaining both. She kept to herself by choice, and not for lack of curiosity from the townsfolk. Every Sunday, she sat alone in the same pew near the back of the church, her hat casting a soft shadow over a face that rarely smiled, but always looked dignified. She attended town meetings without ever speaking, and her weekly trips to the market were swift, precise, and always before noon, when most people were still in church or eating breakfast. Children were told not to bother Miss Carter, and teenagers speculated wildly about why she never married. The truth was far simpler and sadder than the stories. Evelyn hadn't found anyone she trusted enough to let into the small world she had left. The ranch itself was humble, a 2-bedroom house, a barn that moaned under the weight of time, and 10 cattle that she managed alone with the help of a local boy named Jesse, who came by 3 times a week. Every morning began at 5 o'clock, rain or shine, with the same routine: feed the animals, check the fences, mend anything broken. There was no luxury in her life, but there was order, and in that order she found a strange kind of peace. She read in the evenings by kerosene lamp, wrote letters to no one in her journal, and cooked enough food to keep herself going, but not a morsel more. The only signs of life on her property, apart from her own, were the wind and the occasional bird that dared to perch on her windowsill. Evelyn had grown used to the isolation. It protected her from pain, from disappointment, and from the expectations that so many women in town had bowed under. She wore her solitude like armor, convincing herself that freedom was worth the emptiness it brought. Still, there were nights when the house felt too quiet, when the ticking of the clock on the wall became unbearable, and her own thoughts grew loud enough to startle her. On those nights, she would sit on the porch with a wool blanket over her shoulders and stare into the blackness of the open land, listening for anything that might remind her she wasn't the only soul left in the world. Those moments were fleeting, and she chased them away quickly with work and sleep, pretending that longing was a weakness she had long outgrown. Evelyn knew the people in town watched her from afar, not out of malice, but out of a need to explain what they could not understand. A woman alone by choice was a disruption in a world built on family and faith, but she had made her peace with their discomfort. What she hadn't prepared for, however, was that one stormy night would turn the eyes of the entire town directly upon her doorstep and threaten to unravel the carefully stitched fabric of the life she had built. She didn't know it yet, but her silence was about to be broken, not by a mistake, but by a stranger whose arrival would bring not just questions, but choices. And in a town where reputations were as fragile as glass, even the smallest crack could turn into a scandal. That night was just another in a long string of quiet evenings. The air was heavy with moisture, and dark clouds gathered low on the horizon. Evelyn lit her oil lamp early, double-checked the barn, and locked the front door behind her. As the first raindrops fell, she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat near the window, watching as the storm rolled in like a warning. The wind howled through the trees, and the thunder cracked like a whip against the sky. And then 3 loud knocks at the door. She froze. Nobody knocked at Evelyn Carter's door. Not at that hour. Not during a storm. With her heart hammering in her chest, she stood slowly, the warm mug forgotten in her hands. The knocks came again, faster this time. She placed the cup down on the table, reached for the lantern, and stepped cautiously toward the entrance. Outside stood a man, drenched and shivering, his hand pressed against his ribs. His face was barely visible beneath a soaked-brimmed hat, but his voice cut through the wind when he spoke. "Ma'am, please, I need help." Evelyn hesitated, the weight of 100 careful choices pressing down on her in that moment. To open the door was to break the rules she had lived by. But to leave a man out there in that condition was something she could never bring herself to do. She opened the door. The man stumbled across the threshold, dripping water onto the wooden floor with every step. Evelyn held the lantern high, trying to make sense of the figure now standing in her living room. He was tall, lean beneath the soaked layers of flannel and denim, and his face, though rugged and framed by dark stubble, wore an expression of pain and exhaustion. He removed his hat with one hand, revealing hair plastered to his scalp and eyes that were sharp despite the storm's toll. "My name's Luke Harris," he said, voice hoarse from cold and wind. "I didn't mean to intrude, ma'am. My horse, spooked not far from here. Threw me off and ran. I saw your light." Evelyn said nothing at first. Her instincts screamed to remain guarded, but there was something in his voice, an honesty, or perhaps a desperation, that silenced that inner voice. She gestured toward the worn armchair near the fire. "Sit down before you fall over," she said, her tone clipped but not unkind. "I'll get a towel." He didn't argue. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls as Evelyn returned with a thick wool blanket and a towel. She handed them to him and watched as he peeled off his wet coat and began to dry his face and hands. Beneath the grime and water, he was younger than she'd first assumed, likely in his early 30s, with weather-worn features and eyes that carried a heaviness not easily earned by time alone. "You're lucky you didn't break your neck," she said, returning to the kitchen to put the kettle on. "This land is unforgiving after dark." He gave a tired chuckle. "Tell me about it. I've been trying to find a place called Dry Creek Junction. Figured I could reach it by nightfall. Guess I figured wrong." Evelyn paused. Dry Creek was nearly 15 miles north. He'd been way off course. She studied him again, his boots scuffed, one knee of his jeans torn and muddy. "There was no pack, no saddlebag. You travel often without a map or supplies?" she asked pointedly. He looked at her then, and for a moment, the weariness dropped away, replaced by something sharper. "I'm not running, if that's what you're asking," he said, somewhere quieter. "Just moving. Looking to start over." The kettle began to whistle. She turned away and poured 2 cups of tea, setting one down on the small table beside his chair. The warmth of the fire and the drink brought some color back to his face, and he sat in silence for a long minute. The crackle of the hearth the only sound between them. Evelyn folded her arms across her chest and leaned against the doorway. She wasn't used to company, especially not male company, and certainly not after dark. Every decision she had made since her parents died had been about preservation, of the land, of her name, of her autonomy. Letting a stranger in, no matter the circumstance, went against everything she had built, but he hadn't asked for more than shelter, not even food. "You'll sleep in the barn," she said finally. "There's straw and an old cot. I'll bring you a dry blanket and a lantern. Come morning you can get on your way." Luke nodded slowly. Fair enough. She gathered what she needed and led him outside through the rain, which had eased but not stopped. The barn was cold but dry, and once she was satisfied he had what he needed, she turned to go. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he said, stopping her in her tracks. She looked back, eyes narrowing. "How do you know my name?" He hesitated. "Saw the name carved into the gate on my way up the road. Wasn't trying to spook you." "Carter Ranch." She studied him a moment longer, then left without a word, closing the barn door behind her. Inside the house once more, she sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around her cooling tea. She told herself it was just one night, an act of decency, nothing more. People helped each other out there when it mattered. It didn't have to mean anything beyond that, but the unease in her chest didn't fade. She slept lightly, boots still by the door, rifle loaded in the corner, and when morning came, it brought not the usual calm of routine, but the sudden unwelcome sound of a familiar voice, one she hadn't heard in months but could never mistake. "Evelyn?" called Martha Green from outside. "I saw the barn. Light on last night, everything all right?" Evelyn's stomach turned. She stepped onto the porch, squinting against the pale morning light. Martha stood near the gate, shawl clutched tightly around her plump frame, eyes sharp with curiosity. A rooster crowed somewhere in the distance, but the sound was drowned out by the thudding in Evelyn's chest. I was up checking the animals, Evelyn said evenly. Storm spooked them. Martha tilted her head, clearly unconvinced. Her eyes drifted toward the barn. You've got company? Evelyn hesitated. Lying would only make it worse. Someone got caught in the storm, she admitted. He's leaving today. The older woman sniffed, lips tightening. Mother was always generous. I see, I suppose hospitality runs in the family. There was nothing warm in her voice, just enough condescension to make the message clear. Without another word, Martha turned and began walking back toward the road. Evelyn watched her go, heart sinking with each step. The damage was already done. Martha had seen what she wanted to see, and by the time she reached town, so would everyone else. She turned back to the house, face pale with the weight of consequence. For the first time in years, the world she had so carefully controlled had slipped through her fingers because she'd opened a door. Luke emerged from the barn shortly after, rubbing sleep from his eyes, oblivious to the storm that had already begun to gather again, not in the sky but in whispers, stares, and judgments that would soon descend on Evelyn Carter like a flood no lantern could hold back. By the time Evelyn had returned from tending the cattle and checking the fence line, the air had shifted. Not in temperature or scent, but in the way it pressed against her chest. She could feel it. Something intangible had begun to crack the boundaries of her world. Luke was sitting at the kitchen table when she walked in, a cup of black coffee warming his hands. He had found the old tin canister by himself and boiled water without asking. For a moment, the scene could have been mistaken for a domestic morning, two people quietly sharing a routine. But it wasn't. It was temporary. At least, that was what Evelyn kept telling herself. You've got eyes on you, Luke said without looking up. She stiffened. Who? Woman, red scarf, heavy-set, real curious? Martha Green, Evelyn replied, barely concealing the dread in her voice. Friend of my mother's. She used to be. Luke nodded. She didn't act like it. She never does. She didn't. Have to explain more. In a town like theirs, curiosity was rarely innocent, and Martha Green was the kind of woman who moved through life collecting pieces of other people's business like precious gems. Evelyn didn't need to imagine what was already being said. She knew. In a place where everyone's virtue was public currency, hospitality could quickly be spun into scandal, and she had just handed Martha a full story on a silver platter. She sat across from Luke, folded her hands on the table and met his gaze. You need to leave before noon, I figured, he said, not offended. I'll find a way to Dry Creek. Evelyn shook her head. Too late. By now she's told everyone. They'll know you stayed the night. It doesn't matter what really happened. He leaned back slightly, eyes searching her face. Does it matter to you? She hesitated. What matters is that I'm not given the benefit of the doubt. Not here. Not as a woman living alone. My name is all I have. Luke nodded again, slower this time. Understood. But the quiet agreement didn't offer any relief. The damage wasn't theoretical. It was already unfolding. By the time she made it into town that afternoon, she could see it in the way people looked at her. Not directly, not rudely, just long enough, quiet enough. The silence that fell in the grocer's shop when she walked in was louder than any accusation. Two women pretended to rearrange bags of flour, whispering just loud enough for Evelyn to feel their stares pressing against her back. The butcher, who had always been polite if distant, now avoided eye contact altogether. Evelyn moved through the shop quickly, buying only what she couldn't put off another day: sugar, kerosene, coffee. She paid with exact change, her fingers cold despite the warmth of there. As she stepped outside, she nearly bumped into someone she wished she hadn't seen: Reverend Paul Wilkins, a narrow man with deep lines around his mouth and a gaze that had always felt more like a judgment than a blessing. He greeted her with a soft, rehearsed smile, the kind that never reached his eyes. Miss Carter, he said gently. A word, if you have a moment. She stiffened. Of course. They walked a few steps away from the store's entrance, into the shade of the church's outer wall. He folded his hands in front of him, head slightly tilted as if to convey concern. Evelyn recognized the posture. It was the same one he had used the day of her father's funeral, and again when her mother passed. The voice of gentle correction, disguised as compassion. "I've heard some troubling accounts," he began, never quite meeting her eyes. "I don't mean topiary, but you know how tightly knit our community is. People talk. It's not always kind." Evelyn said nothing. She didn't need to. He continued. "A man was seen on your property, staying overnight. I understand it may have been an act of charity, stormy weather, dangerous terrain, but you must see how it appears." "To whom?" she asked. He blinked. "Woman of your standing." "To everyone. Appearances are a foundation of trust, Miss Carter, especially for a—" "And what would you have me do?" she asked, her voice flat. "Preserve." "Appearances? Let a man die in the storm to—" "No," he said quickly, too quickly, "but there are remedies, steps to correct misunderstandings. If this gentleman intends to stay in the area, perhaps—" "No," she cut in, sharper than she intended. "He's leaving today." The Reverend pursed his lips. "Still, the impression remains. The council has asked me to reach out. They're concerned about the precedent, about the influence it might have. I'm not a child to be protected from my own choices," she said, voice rising, "needing the council's approval to help someone in need. And I don't recall—" He took a step back, not offended, but cautious now. "I understand your pride," he said softly, "but understand mine as well. My duty is to uphold what is right, and sometimes that means encouraging our members to take steps that preserve not just personal dignity, but community order." Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "You mean my reputation?" He didn't deny it. She left. Him, standing in the shade, walked briskly down the street and mounted her horse with the groceries tied to the saddle. The ride home was a blur. Anger rose like heat in her chest, but beneath it was something colder, more unnerving. Fear. Not fear of punishment, but of being swallowed by the very town she had tried so hard to keep at arm's length. All these years, spent alone, careful, quiet, and still, one night, one choice, had undone it all. When she reached the ranch, Luke was saddling a borrowed mare, ready to leave. He looked up as she rode in, reading her face like a seasoned scout. "Didn't go." "Well," she slid off her horse, jaw tight. "They think I sinned." He gave a humorless chuckle. "That's usually how it goes. They want me to fix it." He nodded slowly, not asking how. Evelyn stood there, dust rising around her boots, the late afternoon sun painting the porch in gold. She could already see the road ahead, not the one that led out of town, but the one that spiraled into more whispers, more judgment, more decisions that were no longer hers to make. And she knew that what came next wouldn't be fair or simple. It never was, especially not for women like her. The wind that afternoon carried a dryness that stuck to Evelyn's skin and throat, as if the world outside was reflecting the tension she carried within. Back at the ranch, she placed the sack of groceries on the kitchen counter with more force than necessary, the jars rattling against each other in protest. Luke remained outside, pretending to busy himself with the mare, but she knew he felt it too. The weight of what had been set in motion, a sequence neither of them had asked for, yet both were now part of. She lit the stove and set water to boil, her hands moving out of habit rather than need. The silence that had once comforted her now echoed with unspoken things, questions, accusations, warnings disguised as suggestions. The conversation with Reverend Wilkins replayed in her mind, each word sharper the second time. Appearances, community order, remedies. When Luke stepped in from the porch, she barely turned. He wiped his hands on his jeans, eye-striking her carefully. "So, what's the verdict?" She didn't answer right away. She took 2 cups from the shelf, poured the water, and handed him one. "They want me to make it right," she said after a moment. "Right," he echoed, taking a sip. "How does one do that exactly?" Evelyn leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "There's only one way, in their eyes." His brow lifted, a slow realization dawning. "They want us to get married. They don't want it, they expect it. And if I refuse, they'll ruin you." She didn't need to nod. He understood. She could see it in the way he held the cup tighter, knuckles white with thought, his jaw clenched, a muscle ticking. At the edge. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low. "I didn't mean for any of this." "No one ever does," she replied. The words hung between them like smoke. Outside, the sky turned a dull amber, the sun sinking behind the hills. The stillness was deceiving. Inside her something churned, an ancient grief rising, grief for her autonomy, for the life she had tried to keep whole after it had already been broken by loss. She had fought so hard to exist quietly, and now the town's gaze burned like wildfire. Through her walls, "I could leave," Luke offered. "Now, you'd never see me again. That won't change anything, they've already decided." "Then maybe I should face them. You don't understand, it's not about what's true, it's about what they believe is proper." He looked at her, a long moment of silence, before he set the cup down and walked toward Thetible. He pulled out the chair but didn't sit. "You deserve better than this." She turned away, staring out the window. Deserving doesn't change reality. That night, she sat by the fire again, the same place she had the night before his knock changed everything. But now the shadows were longer, the silence heavier. Luke didn't speak much, sensing the storm that brewed not in the sky, but within her. When she finally stood to head to bed, he caught her wrist gently. "I'll be gone by morning." She didn't answer. Her eyes fell to where his hand held hers, and for the first time she saw him not as a stranger, but as a man caught in the same storm. They were both trapped, different reasons, same cage. She pulled her hand free and walked away. Sleep did not come easily. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the sound of crickets and wind pressing against the windows. She thought of her mother's voice, calm and sure, warning her that reputation was a kind of currency, easier to lose than to earn. She had ignored the wisdom then, believing solitude could shield her. Now she knew better. Solitude wasn't protection. It was a fragile house built on the hope that no one would look too closely. In the morning, the knock came not from the door, but from the hooves outside. Evelyn stepped onto the porch and saw the same carriage that had taken her parents to church. 1,000 Sundays. Inside was Elder Whitman, head of the church council, and beside him Reverend Wilkins again, his expression unreadable. "Miss Carter," Whitman began, doffing his hat. "May we come in?" She didn't answer, but stepped aside. Inside, they sat stiffly at the table, hands folded like prayer. "We understand this must be difficult," the elder said. "It's not our intention to shame you." "But shame has come nonetheless," she replied coolly. "We seek resolution, a path forward for the sake of the community, for your future." Wilkins leaned in, voice gentle. "Question your conduct. A wedding would bring clarity. It would." "Quiet those who wish to, and if I say no," she asked. Whitman sighed. "Then we'll be forced to hold a hearing. It won't be kind." She stood slowly, back straight, voice calm. "You've made your point." They left without another word. As the dust from their wheels settled on the road, Luke appeared again. "You're going to do it, aren't you?" She didn't answer. "Because you have no choice." Still, she said nothing. He exhaled, walked to the fence, stared out over the land. "Then I'll do it. We'll do it. Together." She turned toward him, not expecting those words, not expecting the calm in his face. "Why? Because it's not your burden alone, and because I know what it's like to be hunted by a lie." The wind moved through, the dry grass whispering secrets the way the town always did. But this time Evelyn didn't feel quite so alone. For the first time, the story they were being forced into might be shaped by their own hands, even if the start had not been theirs to choose. The wind had shifted again. This time it wasn't the gusty dryness of a Texas summer or the stillness before a storm, but something quieter, more internal. The kind of shift that settles between two people and changes the way they look at each other without a single word needing to be spoken. Evelyn stood on the porch, arms folded tightly, watching the road where the carriage had vanished. Behind her, Luke's voice, low and steady, still echoed in her mind. "Then I'll do it, we'll do it together." She hadn't replied, not out loud, not with a nod or even a look, but something inside her, something deep beneath the layers of pride and grief, had registered the weight of his words and the way they had landed, not with pressure, but with quiet solidarity. He joined her on the porch, leaning slightly against the wooden post, the sleeve of his shirt still damp where he had wiped his hands after working the pump. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard, gilding the fence line and bathing the field in gold, but neither of them looked at it. They kept their eyes on the same spot in the distance, as if staring hard enough might unravel the tangle. Their lives had become, "You don't have to say yes," Luke said finally, "but if you do, it's not pity. I won't offer you that. Evelyn glanced sideways at him, narrowing her eyes. Then what is it? A solution. Maybe a second chance for both of us. She wasn't ready to call it anything close to that. Her mind turned over every angle, every risk, every silent price she would pay. But she also knew the math was already written by others. If she rejected the marriage, the town would not forget. They would not forgive. Her land, her name, her ability to even speak in public without being reminded of her conduct, it would all dissolve under the weight of that one stormy night. "You don't know me," she said, her voice quiet, steady. "I know what it's like to be judged by something you didn't do," Luke replied. "Most can say." That's more than she studied him then truly looked. He wasn't charming in the polished way many men tried to be. He wasn't soft either. There was something hardened about him, shaped by too many miles, too many closed doors, too many assumptions made by strangers. But he stood straight. He offered no excuses for his presence, and he had not once tried to barter his way out of blame. That alone earned him more ground than most. Inside the house, the walls felt smaller now, like they were listening. Evelyn walked to the kitchen, poured 2 more cups of coffee and returned, handing one to Luke. He took it with a nod, sitting on the porch step, boots planted firmly in the dirt. "What happens next?" she asked, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "We tell them we've agreed, we set a date, keep it simple, fast." "How fast?" 3 days. That should be enough time to stop them from escalating things." 3 days, she repeated. "That's not enough to prepare." "We're not preparing for a celebration," he said gently. "We're putting out a fire." The truth of it stung. She had never imagined herself in white, never dreamt of being walked down an aisle. That kind of life had never fit into the routine she had built, not since the ranch became her entire world. And now, the idea of wedding, vows spoken under obligation, made her feel as though her bones were hollowing from the inside out. But the alternative was worse. The next day, Luke rode into town alone. Evelyn watched him go, a growing tightness in her chest with each step his horse took away from the ranch. She stayed busy, cleaning tools, oiling hinges, organizing the barn. Jesse arrived to help as usual and noticed something was off. He didn't ask, but he worked slower than normal, watching her closely, like he sensed a shift he couldn't name. By late afternoon, Luke returned. He tied the horse quietly and approached her at the corral, where she was hammering a loose board back into place. "They've agreed," he said. "No hearing. Ceremony in the chapel at noon in 3 days." She didn't stop hammering. "And the gossip? They'll still talk. But a ring on your finger will turn whispers into shrugs. Nothing scandalous about a husband staying in his wife's house." She finally looked at him. "And what will they say about you?" He gave a slow smile. "Probably that I found a woman too strong to be tamed." "That's not a compliment. Wasn't meant as one. Just the truth." That night, Evelyn sat at the table with a piece of paper in front of her. She held the pen like it was foreign, unsure where to begin. Finally, she started writing. A list, not of things to buy or tasks to complete, but a reckoning of who she would be on the other side of this marriage. Names she might be called, friends she might lose, parts of herself that might never come back. When she finished, she folded the paper and tucked it into her Bible, her mother's Bible. Not out of faith, but out of memory. 3 days passed like water through her hands. She didn't cry, she didn't dream. She moved like a woman fulfilling a contract, each step measured, each decision rooted in the need for survival, not sentiment. Luke stayed out of her way, working quietly, respectful of her space, and when he spoke, it was only when necessary. On the morning of the 3rd day, Evelyn dressed in the simplest dress she owned, blue cotton unadorned. She pinned her hair back, tied her boots, and looked at herself in the mirror. There was no joy, but there was resolve. Luke met her outside, freshly shaven, his shirt clean and tucked. He looked nervous, not of her, but of the act, the ritual, the finality. They rode into town side by side, no carriage, no escort. The chapel doors were open. Inside, a few townspeople sat in silence, eyes tracking their every move. Reverend Wilkins stood at the altar, hands folded. Martha Green sat in, the third pew, face unreadable. Evelyn walked forward without trembling. She met Luke's eyes as they stood before the pastor, and as the first words were spoken, she realized that the story they had both been forced into might just become something else entirely. But not today. Today, it was a rescue. Not of love, but of dignity. And in that, there was a strange kind of beginning. The afternoon after the ceremony arrived without fanfare or applause. There was no meal shared among guests, no music, no photographs or laughter spilling out of the chapel doors. Evelyn and Luke left the small gathering quietly, each bearing the weight of what had just occurred like a cloak neither of them had chosen but were now bound to wear. The town's eyes, which had previously burned with judgment, now watched with cautious approval, as if the act of saying vows had neatly sewn, closed a narrative that had threatened to unravel their fragile order. Back at the ranch, the silence was different. He was no longer a guest and she was no longer alone, yet neither felt like anything had truly changed, except everything had. Evelyn washed her hands in the basin, staring at the water as it swirled red with dust from the fields. Luke was outside splitting firewood, each strike of the axe echoing through the yard with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, almost desperate. She didn't know what to call him now. Husband, stranger, solution. By the third morning of their legal bond, a letter arrived. It came not by post but by hand, delivered by a man on horseback who said nothing, only tipped his hat and rode off before Evelyn could ask his name. The envelope bore no return address. The paper inside was creased sharply and smelled faintly of tobacco. She opened it alone, standing at the edge of the barn while Luke worked near the trough. She read the words once, then again, then a third time. Her fingers gripped the edge of the letter so tightly, it tore slightly along the fold. It was a warning, not against her, but against him. Luke Harris, it said, had fled a property in Wyoming 2 months prior. A fire had destroyed most of the estate. Ranch larger than hers by tenfold, and though no charges had been filed, rumors abounded that he had set the blaze himself to escape debts and failed partnerships. The letter spoke of lies, unpaid wages, and disappearing livestock. It ended with a final line that chilled her. A man who burns his past rarely leaves it behind. She found Luke in the barn, rolling a barrel into place. His shirt was damp with sweat, and his face bore the calm of someone who had spent the morning solving small, solvable problems. "I got a letter," she said flatly. He didn't look up right away. "About us?" "About you." That made him pause. He straightened slowly, wiped his brow and turned to face her. "From who?" "No name." She handed it to him. He read it in silence, jaw tight, eyes scanning with the same practice control she'd come to recognize. When he finished, he handed it back and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "I knew it might follow me," he said. "Didn't know it'd find me so soon." "Is it true?" she asked. No malice in her tone, just weariness. "The fire happened." "Yes." "And?" "And I didn't set it. But people think you did. They need someone to blame. I was the last one standing after the debts piled up and the crops failed. The partners pulled out, the workers left. I stayed. Then one night, flames. I lost everything." "Convenient." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You think I planned it? Burned a house my grandfather built with his bare hands? Risked my own neck in a windstorm to run out of that hell alive?" "I don't know what to think," she admitted. "You showed up at my door with nothing. You offered to marry me to save face, and now this. I'm trying to make sense of a man I barely know." He stepped closer, slowly. "I didn't come here to lie to you, Evelyn. I came here because I needed a place to start over. You gave me that without asking why. That was before I had to tie my name to yours in front of half the county. I didn't force your hand. No, but now mine's burned alongside yours." They stood in silence for a long time. The sun was high, the light unrelenting. She felt its heat not just on her skin but in her chest, tightening around her ribs. Luke looked down, then back at her. "If you want to undo it, this marriage, I won't stop you. I'll ride out tonight. Leave the land, the name, everything. You don't owe me anything." But that wasn't the point. It wasn't about owing. It was about what she had already paid. Her reputation, her certainty, her solitude. Walking away now wouldn't erase what had already been said, or whispered or assumed. Undoing the vows wouldn't unmake the stairs. The fire had already spread. She folded the letter carefully, slipped it into her coat pocket. Me, not yet. No one will hear about this from. He studied her face, waiting for more, but she said nothing else. She turned and walked back toward the house, leaving him with the weight of his past and the silence of her decision. That evening she couldn't eat. She sat on the porch, staring at the horizon until the sky darkened and the stars blinked awake. One by one, Luke joined her eventually, sitting a few feet away, his hands resting on his knees. "You said once you knew what it felt like to be judged for something you didn't do," she said. "I did. And now I do too." He didn't argue. "I don't forgive easily," she added. "I'm not asking you to." More silence. But this time, it wasn't heavy, just real. They sat there until the chill crept into the boards of the porch and the lantern light flickered low. And even then, neither moved first. Because some truths once revealed don't demand resolution. They just need to sit beside you for a while. The next morning broke with a quiet so deep it seemed unnatural. The bird song that usually greeted dawn was absent, and even the wind had lost its usual restless whisper. Evelyn rose before first light, not because she couldn't sleep, but because the bed felt unfamiliar now. Too wide and too quiet, with the knowledge that someone else lived under the same roof, even if he slept in the barn, out of a respect they hadn't spoken about but silently agreed upon. She moved through the house with slow, precise motions, as if each sound might wake something dangerous. The coffee she brewed tasted bitter. The bread she sliced was dry. Everything felt slightly off, like her entire world had tilted a few degrees and left her unsure of her footing. Outside, the ranch waited. The animals still needed feeding, the fences still needed mending, and the routines still held. But the ground beneath those routines felt unsteady now, as if any wrong step might reveal the hollowness underneath. She found herself glancing toward the barn more than once, catching glimpses of movement through the slats, hearing the dull thud of wood being stacked or a low cough from deep within. When Luke finally approached the house near mid-morning, his expression was unreadable. He looked like he had spent the night thinking hard, harder than most men ever bothered to. He didn't say anything until he was standing on the porch, boots leaving dust on the steps. "I'll be gone by tomorrow," he said plainly. Evelyn didn't look up from the saddle she was oiling. "That's not necessary." "It might be." She set the rag down slowly. "People won't stop talking just because you leave. I know, but they won't be watching your house every day. Won't be waiting to see what the newlyweds are doing behind closed doors. They'll assume I drove you away." "They might," he admitted, "but they might also forget us faster that way." Evelyn stood, wiping her hands on her skirt. "And if I say I don't want to be left holding this alone?" His eyes softened just slightly. "Then I stay, but you have to know something," she nodded. "Tell me." "I came here looking for distance, from my past, from my mistakes, from a life that burned down around me. I thought maybe if I kept my head down, worked hard, didn't ask for much, the world might stop trying to punish me." "And did it?" "No," he said quietly. "Me more grace than I deserve. But you did. You didn't judge me. Not at first. And even now you've given." Evelyn looked out over the pasture, where two of her cows had wandered toward the far edge of the fence. The grass was thinning in patches, signs that winter was no longer a distant thought but an approaching presence. "Grace isn't the same as trust," she said, "and it sure as hell isn't the same as peace." "I know." She turned to face him fully. "They gave me a choice without calling it that. Marry you or be dragged through hearings, condemned in sermons, and written off as a cautionary tale for every girl raised within 10 miles of here. You weren't the villain in that story, but you weren't the hero either. I never claimed to be. That's the only reason I said yes." Silence again. Not cold, not cruel, just honest. The kind of silence that existed between two people, standing on the edge of something neither of them had asked for, but both now had to live with. By mid-afternoon, Evelyn rode into town alone. She needed supplies and, though she wouldn't admit it out loud, needed to see the temperature of the place now that the wedding was official and the gossip had turned its attention to watching instead of whispering. At the general store, she felt the eyes again. Not as sharp as before, but still present. The cashier, a younger woman named Clara, greeted her with a hesitant smile and avoided her gaze too quickly. As she paid for her goods, the door creaked open, and a voice she hadn't heard in years filled the room. "Well, I'll be damned. Evelyn Carter." She turned to see Jacob Mays, a former suitor from long before her parents passed. Older now, heavier, but still carrying the same smug confidence. He walked toward her, arms open like they were still something to her. "Didn't expect to hear you'd finally settled down," he said, clearly enjoying the moment. "Thought you'd stay stubborn and solitary forever." Evelyn's jaw tensed. "Didn't ask for your thoughts, Jacob. Just saying. Must have been some storm if it blew that stranger right into your arms, or your house, or your bed." The words landed like stones, not because they were particularly cruel, but because they were designed to sound casual, harmless. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence she offered him was colder than any insult she could have thrown. As she walked past, she heard him mutter under his breath, just loud enough for the room to catch it. Once a Carter, always a caution. She rode home slower than usual, the weight of town and rumor and the narrowing choices pressing down like an invisible hand on her spine. When she arrived, Luke was still on the Porsche, same spot, same posture, as if he hadn't moved since she left. He stood when he saw her, and for a moment they both hovered in a strange limbo, no longer strangers, not yet partners. Just two people caught in a choice that was never really a choice at all. She dismounted, tied the horse, and without a word, walked past him and into the house. But this time when he followed, she didn't stop him. She didn't offer a drink or ask where he'd been. She simply sat at the table and looked at him for a long while. "We stay," she said. He nodded once. "But don't ask me for more than that." "Not now. I won't." And they didn't speak again that night. But they stayed. Not for love. Not yet. But for something that might one day resemble it, if time and truth and silence allowed. The night before the ceremony had been still, in a way that didn't feel natural. No wind through the trees, no crickets in the tall grass, just the sound of Evelyn's breath in the dark and the distant creak of the barn settling. She hadn't yet written the letter she knew she would. She had gone over the words in her mind, not because she doubted the need for them, but because she doubted her right to say them at all. But by midnight, with the fire in the hearth down to coals and the rest of the house cloaked in that soft, quiet blackness unique to rural land, she lit a single lamp, pulled the paper from the drawer, and sat at the kitchen table with the pen, shaking slightly in her hand. She didn't write a confession. It wasn't an apology either. It was something between a goodbye and a warning. She thanked Luke for his decency, if not his honesty, and told him she couldn't enter into something so permanent without certainty, not certainty in him, but in herself. She explained that the ceremony would be meaningless if the woman standing there didn't believe in the vows she was speaking. And right now, Evelyn Carter didn't believe in anything more than the silence of her own soul. She folded the letter and placed it on the table, weighted down with the only silver candlestick she owned. She gathered a small bag, no more than what could be carried without drawing attention. Water, bread, a change of clothes, her mother's ring wrapped in a piece of flannel. Her boots were already worn in. Her coat still smelled of smoke and lavender oil. She moved through the house as if it were already someone else's, memorizing the lines of the walls, the way the front door creaked on the third hinge. She walked into the barn just before dawn, the darkness soft enough to see by, but still deep enough to hide her movements. Her horse Bay should have been standing near the east stall, where she always kept him after rain. But the space was empty. Her steps quickened as she checked every pen, every stall, each one filled with cattle or the quiet shifting of sleeping livestock. But no Bay. Her stomach dropped. She checked again, then again, the panic creeping slowly like rising water. No saddle was missing, no harness left out of place. It was as if the animal had vanished into the fog. She stepped back out into the yard, breath fogging in the morning chill. The world around her was beginning to stir, birds returning, sky lightening. If she didn't leave soon, someone would see, someone would ask, someone would follow. Then she heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the front of the house. Luke appeared in the clearing like something summoned by her guilt. He wasn't surprised to see her standing there, bag in hand, face pale and mouth parted, with the cold realization that her plan had failed before it ever began. He didn't look angry, just tired, like he understood too much to be surprised by betrayal anymore. "I figured you'd try," he said softly. She didn't answer. "Bay's not stolen," he added. "Say why." "Just said it was a favor. He's with Jesse. I asked him to take the horse yesterday." Didn't her hand tightened around the bag strap. "Why?" "Because I had a feeling." "You planned to trap me?" He shook his head. "No, I planned to give you a night to think, and to stop you if you ran." She set the bag down, shoulders straightening. "You don't get to decide what I run from." "I know. But I also know that running wouldn't change what happens next. Not here. Not for you." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She looked toward the tree line, toward the dirt road that curved out of view, the same path her parents had once traveled every Sunday to church, every summer to the next town for cattle auctions and seed fairs. It had always been a road that led away, but never out. "I can't marry you like this," she whispered. "Never should have been broken. I can't marry anyone because they think it'll fix what—" "I didn't ask you to," Luke replied. "But you didn't stop them either." He looked down, then back at her. "Because I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd want someone standing beside you when they tried to bury you with words." The stillness between them returned, but it no longer felt safe. It felt exposed, fragile. "You still can walk away," he said. "Even now. I won't stop you again. But the town will. They might." She picked up the bag, held it for a moment, then let it fall again. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the quiet understanding that there was no good path left, just a choice between pain and survival. "I never wanted a life like this," she said. "Neither did I." The sun broke over the ridge, casting the ranch in gold, the kind of light that made everything look softer than it really was. Luke turned to go back to the house, leaving her in the yard with the wind and the dust and the truth. She didn't follow right away. She needed a moment longer to let the road disappear from her vision, to accept that it would not save her. When she finally stepped inside, the letter was still on the table, the silver candlestick beside it. She picked it up, unfolded the note, read it once more, and then, without ceremony, fed it to the fire. The paper curled quickly, the ink vanishing before the flames even reached the center. There would be no escape, only endurance. The hours after dawn carried a different kind of weight. Evelyn moved through them with mechanical precision, checking the corral gates, washing the few remaining dishes from the night before, brushing the dust from the front steps that she already knew would return by evening. Everything around her was familiar, but nothing felt the same. The air pressed differently against her skin, and every small sound seemed louder than it ought to be. Even the sound of her own footsteps echoed with a tension that hadn't been there days before. By mid-morning, she had retreated into the house, intending to make tea, but the kettle remained cold. Her thoughts had drifted too far again, and when the knock came at the door, it startled her so deeply. She dropped the tin of sugar, scattering it across the floor like tiny shards of light. She opened the door without asking who stood on the other side. There weren't many who knocked at her place, certainly not unannounced. Evelyn, it was Sheriff Tom Daniels, the lines in his face deeper than she remembered, his hat low against the rising sun, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had spent his whole life walking the line between justice and concession. He had been a friend of her father, had eaten meals at this very table when Evelyn was still too young to be seated without wiping her hands, twice on her dress. "Sheriff," she greeted, stepping aside. He removed his hat as he entered, wiping the sweat from his brow with a handkerchief that looked older than the badge he wore. His eyes swept the room, pausing briefly at the fireplace, then the letterless table, and finally, on her face. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "You wouldn't be here unless you meant to." He nodded, not disagreeing. He sat slowly, the chair creaking beneath him. Evelyn remained standing, arms crossed, waiting. "I came because I heard some things. Things I don't like hearing," he said. "Heard about the wedding, sure. That didn't surprise me. But then I heard about what nearly happened the night before." She said nothing, her jaw tightened. "You didn't run," he continued, "but you were ready to." She nodded once. Someone tipped me off, said you might try, didn't say who, just asked if I'd make sure nothing got in your way if you did. Now she looked at him, really looked. Was it Luke? The sheriff gave a half shrug. He came by my office 3 days ago. Didn't say much, just asked what would happen if things turned worse, if someone wanted to hurt you for what they believed. Told me to keep an eye on your place, just in case. Evelyn blinked, unsure what to say. I've known a lot of men who claim to care, Daniels went on. Most of them care until it cost them something. That man, he didn't ask me to protect him, didn't even ask me to stop Theramas, just wanted to make sure no one came for you if things went sideways. She sank slowly into the chair across from him, her legs heavier than they should have been. I don't trust easily, she admitted. That makes 2 of us, he replied. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that came only when 2 people had lived too long with truths they couldn't speak aloud. Outside, a hawk called once, then again, before soaring into the wide sky. Daniels glanced toward the sound, then back at her. I can't tell you what's right for your future, Evelyn. You've always been more stubborn than the rest of us combined, but I know fear when I see it. I know it makes people do things they wouldn't. Otherwise, I wasn't afraid of Luke, she said quietly. Then what were you afraid of? She looked at the table, the empty space where the letter had burned, and not recognizing who I'd become. Of waking up one day? Daniels nodded, his fingers tapping the brim of his hat slowly. That's the hardest kind of fear to face. Not what others might do, but what you might let them turn you into. He stood, replacing his hat. You ever need someone to speak for you in that town, I'll do it. Might not change their minds, but I won't let them pretend you didn't fight to live the way you believed you should. Why? She asked. Because your father would have done the same for me. And because there aren't enough voices in this county speaking for women who never asked for permission to survive. She followed him to the door. He stepped out into the sun, paused on the porch. And Evelyn, he's not your burden. Don't let anyone make you carry a man's sins that don't belong to you. She nodded, but he was already walking toward his horse, his silhouette disappearing slowly against the brightness of the day. Back inside, Evelyn sat again. The quiet returned, but it no longer pressed down. It stretched, leaving space for thought, for memory, for the things she had not been able to say before. Luke's footsteps came not long after, boots heavy on the front path. He paused in the doorway, eyes searching hers. Sheriff said he stopped. Bye, Luke said. She nodded. He did. You told him. I didn't have to. He looked uncertain, as if unsure whether her silence was accusation or acceptance. I meant what I asked him, Luke added. Try to make you stay. I didn't know if you'd go, but I knew someone might. I would have stayed anyway, she said. Wouldn't have made me any freer. Not for them, not even for you, but because running, he took that in, then sat across from her. I'm not going to be your reason for pain, he said. You're not. You're just part of it. Now, like this house, like this town, like everything else I didn't ask for but still have to carry, they didn't touch, they didn't smile. But they sat there, the 2 of them, like people who finally understood what it meant to remain. Not for survival, but for something quieter, more dangerous, endurance wrapped in truth. A marriage made not of romance, but of resistance. And maybe, in team, something more, but not yet. Not today. Today was for staying. The chapel had never looked more somber. Sunlight filtered through the dust-streaked windows in narrow beams, cutting across the wooden pews like a series of sharp, judgmental lines. It wasn't a place of joy that day. It was a room of silence and tightly pressed lips, of sideways glances and the creak of old floorboards under the weight of unwanted ceremony. Evelyn stood at the entrance in her plain blue dress, one hand resting against the doorframe, as if she needed the wood to keep herself upright. Her breath was steady, but her heart thudded in her chest like it was trying to break free. She had braided her hair back that morning with hands that barely stopped shaking. She hadn't eaten, hadn't spoken to Luke since the night before. Words had felt too large, too final. She stepped inside. Every eye turned, every whisper stopped. Reverend Wilkins stood at the altar, his Bible already open, his face a studied mask of duty over curiosity. Martha Green sat near the front, lips pursed, eyes gleaming with barely contained superiority. Others filled the pews behind her, Store owners, farmers, wives, widows, all dressed in their Sunday best, watching a woman they'd once respected march herself into what they saw as redemption through submission. Luke was already there, standing beside the altar, his shirt collar stiff, hair combed neatly for the first time since Evelyn had met him. He looked like a man resigned to whatever came next. Not nervous, not joyful, just ready. She walked down the aisle alone. No music played. No flowers adorned the benches. Just the smell of old wood and fading incense, and the echo of her footsteps. She stood beside him, close enough to hear the hitch in his breath, to see the tightness around his eyes. Reverend Wilkins began. He spoke of duty, of restoration, of the sacred bonds formed in the face of human weakness. Every word he uttered felt like it was aimed not at celebrating, but at correcting. His tone held no warmth. It was a sermon disguised as a union. The verses quoted were not about love, but about obedience, about cleaving to one another not for joy, but to withstand judgment. Evelyn Shands remained at her sides, fingers digging slightly into her skirt. "Do you, Evelyn Carter, take this man?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. She did not look at Luke. She looked past him, toward the cross. On the back wall, the place her parents had once knelt every week. She remembered her mother's voice, not from prayers, but from warnings about dignity, about the value of silence when the world insisted on noise. "I do," she said, and her voice did not shake. When it came time for Luke's vow, he didn't rush. His eyes were on her, steady and unwavering. "I do," he said. Reverend Wilkins closed the book with a definitive clap. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. May this union bring peace to your house and honor to your name." There was no kiss, no applause, just a shift in the room's air as though everyone had exhaled at once. The pews creaked again as people rose, already turning away, eager to carry this new version of Evelyn Carter back to their homes, to retell it over dinner, to reframe her choices as something less threatening and more familiar. Evelyn and Luke remained at the altar as the room emptied. Neither of them moved. Finally, she turned to him. "We should go." He nodded. "You sure you're all right?" "No. But I will be." They left the chapel through the side door, avoiding the crowd that had already begun forming small, quiet clusters at the steps. No one stopped them. No one congratulated them. The town had gotten what it wanted, a resolution, an ending they could explain. Evelyn had been tamed. Luke had been claimed. The scandal had been sutured with tradition. They rode back in silence, side by side, the afternoon sun beginning its slow descent. The land looked unchanged, but nothing about it felt the same. When they reached the house, Evelyn dismounted first, moving with a stiffness that had little to do with fatigue. She stepped into the kitchen, dropped her gloves on the table, and stared at the empty fireplace. Luke followed but didn't speak. He stood in the doorway like a man unsure of what came next, his new title pressing heavy on his shoulders. She turned slowly to face him. "Why did you look nervous up there?" He blinked. "Because I didn't want to hurt you more than I already have. You didn't make this happen." "No, but I'm part of it now." She nodded, walking past him to the hallway. "You'll take the front room. I can sleep in the barn again." "No," she interrupted. "You're not a secret, not anymore." The door closed behind her with a soft click. That night, Evelyn lay awake long after the lamps had been extinguished. She listened to the creaks of the house as it settled, the groan of the wind through the shutters. Somewhere down the hall, Luke moved barely, but she heard him, a floorboard, a cough, the slight rustle of blankets. It struck her then how final it all felt, how quiet, and how far from freedom dignity sometimes stood. Days after the wedding passed like a haze, with Evelyn moving through them in silence, and Luke occupying the spaces she once claimed alone. He fixed the back gate without asking. He fed the chickens when she forgot. He didn't sleep in the barn again, nor did he step beyond the boundaries of the front room unless invited. They shared meals, but not conversations. Sat across the table, without ever touching. The house no longer echoed with loneliness, but the quiet had shifted from peaceful to weighted, like every object inside held its breath. It was on the fifth evening that the silence broke. The sun was sinking behind the Sioux Ridge, casting long orange shadows over the fields. Evelyn Wason the porch, her boots kicked off and her hair loose around her shoulders, watching the sky like it might offer answers. Luke joined her without a word, handing her a cup of warm tea, the way her mother used to do when storms brewed just beyond the hills. She took it without thanks. Not out of rudeness, but because something about the moment felt balanced already, fragile but not broken. He sat beside her, the wood groaning beneath his weight. "I've got something to tell you," he said finally. She didn't look at him. "I figured," he rubbed his hands together, voice low. "You know most of it by now, the fire, the debts, the partners that walked away. But what you don't know is why I stayed as long as I did." She waited. "I owed something to that land. It wasn't about money, it was about pride. That ranch was the last piece of my family's name. My father died trying to keep it. My brothers left when the first drought hit. I stayed. And then it burned," she said, not as a question. He nodded. "I lost everything in one night. The fire started in the barn. No one knows how. I barely made it out with my coat. Neighbors saw the flames and assumed the worst, that I'd done it for the insurance, which didn't even cover half the damage. They called me a fraud before the ashes cooled. Why didn't you fight it?" "I did. For a while. But it didn't matter. The banks pulled what was left. The law didn't charge me, but the town sentenced me just the same. And I figured maybe they were right, not about the fire, but about me. I'd failed my family, my name, everything." Evelyn turned to him then. His face was drawn, not with guilt, but with the weariness of someone who had carried shame long after it was deserved. "You came here to disappear," she said. "I came here to survive. And instead you got dragged into another scandal." He gave a tired smile. "Seems to be my luck." She looked away, the night deepening around them. "I didn't offer to marry you because I thought I could fix it," he said. "Not your reputation, not mine. I offered because I saw what they were doing to you and I knew exactly how it felt." "That's not enough," she replied. "Not for a lifetime. No, it's not." But it was the truth. And I figured if we started there, maybe one day it would be enough for something better. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the dry grass around the porch. Inside, the fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows. On the walls, Evelyn sipped her tea, then lowered the cup to her lap. "You could have left after the wedding. I know. You still can." He didn't answer. She looked at him again. "Why didn't you?" He hesitated, then spoke slowly. "Because you let me stay, even after the letter, even after you tried to leave. You stayed too, and not because of what the town wanted, because you chose Eto." "No," she said. "I stayed because there was nowhere else to go. But you let me back in, that matters." She wanted to argue, to deny the truth in his words, but she couldn't, not honestly. He stood after a while, the teacup empty, the light gone from the sky. He looked down at her, not expectantly, but with something that almost resembled hope. "I won't ask for your forgiveness, Evelyn, and I won't pretend this is something it's not, but I'll stay as long as you let me, and I'll keep building whatever you're willing to share." Then he turned and stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him. Evelyn remained on the porch long after the night had swallowed the land. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. She just sat with the truth, holding it like something that couldn't yet be named. And when the stars finally took their places overhead, she whispered to the dark, "I never asked for a partner." But deep inside, something shifted, not because he had told her the truth, but because for the first time he had asked for nothing in return. Evelyn woke before dawn, the world outside still caught in the quiet hush that came before light. The house, though now filled with more footsteps and twice the breath, felt heavier, not lighter, for his presence. She moved through the morning with the same methodical steps she always had. Boiling water, feeding the animals, checking the perimeter. But every motion felt observed now, not because Luke hovered, but because he didn't. He gave her space, and yet his absence was no longer silence. It was presence without sound. She found herself watching him through windows, studying the way he worked the fence, the deliberate way he moved without rushing. There was no laziness in him, no idle pacing. And yet there was something in his every movement that mirrored her own restraint. They were two people performing life beside each other, not with each other. By the third day of this new rhythm, Evelyn sat on the porch as he returned from town. Head is mounted and carried 2 small sacks of supplies, flour, salt, a replacement, part for the stove. She watched him walk up the steps, and before he could speak, she said, "I need time." He didn't flinch, didn't ask why. He set the sacks down, removed his hat, and gave a short nod. "How much? I don't know." "All right." She hadn't expected agreement. She had braced herself for resistance, for a conversation full of apologies or explanations, but instead she received understanding, quiet and complete. It made her chest ache more than any fight would have. "I'm not leaving because of the truth," she clarified. "Who I am when I'm not surviving. I'm leaving because I need to remember." He nodded again, slower this time. "Will you come back? If there's still something here worth returning to, I won't change the locks." She almost smiled, almost. That night she packed lightly, just enough for a few weeks. Sturdy clothes, a second pair of boots, her mother's journal, a small stack of bills tucked into the lining of her bag. She didn't tell the town, she didn't leave a note. Luke knew, and that was enough. She rode out at sunrise, the wind behind her, the fields stretching ahead. She didn't look back until the ridge, and when she did, she saw the house standing still against the sky, a quiet sentinel, unmoved by the fact that its inhabitants had fractured. The cabin she went to belonged to her uncle's widow, a woman who lived far enough from town to be invisible, but close enough to send word if needed. May took her in without questions, just warm blankets and hot food, the kind that didn't demand gratitude. The cabin was small, tucked in the trees with a stove that rattled and a window that looked out over the river. Evelyn spent the first week in near silence, waking early, chopping wood, mending clothes she hadn't worn in years. She read through her mother's journal again, pages filled with worry about her father, the land, Evelyn's future. There were no lessons in those pages, just fragments of a woman trying to keep things from breaking. And yet somehow it helped. She wrote letters to no one. She walked along the river until her feet ached. She let herself think about nothing. For the first time in months, her name wasn't on someone else's tongue. By the second week, she began to miss the ranch, not in longing, but in muscle. Her hand itched for the weight of the gate, the pull of a rope, the rhythm of her days. She missed the way the light came through the east window at 6 in the morning, and the way the grass turned golden late afternoon. But most of all, she missed the feeling of purpose, of knowing the land trusted her as much as she trusted it. She thought of Luke less often, and yet when she did, it wasn't with anger, it was with curiosity. How he was managing, whether the stove was fixed, if he'd fed the chickens on time. She remembered the way he had looked at her before she left, not like a man betrayed, but like one bracing himself for absence. May asked once if she planned to return. Evelyn didn't answer directly. She just said, "I'm not running. I just need to come home when I choose to, not because I'm expected." May seemed to understand. 3 weeks passed before Evelyn packed again. She left a small envelope of money on the counter and rode out before dawn. The road back felt different, like she was returning to something not broken, but waiting. The land rose and fell beneath her horse like a breath, each mile whispering the same thing, almost. She reached the ranch just after noon. The gate creaked the same. The barn smelled of hay and dust. The house stood unchanged. Luke was on the porch, sitting with a book he wasn't reading. He looked up when she rode in, stood slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't ask questions. He just watched her dismount, tie their ins and walk toward him. She stood at the bottom of the steps. "I'm not here to stay," she said. He nodded. "But I'm not leaving either." Another nod. "I need more time, but I want to spend it here. Then we'll find a way," he said. That night they shared dinner, not as husband and wife, not as strangers, but as two people rebuilding something neither of them had asked. For from pieces neither fully understood, the silence between them had changed again. It no longer held judgment, only the slow, steady weight of beginnings. The chill of late autumn had begun to settle over the land when Evelyn stepped out onto the porch one morning and saw Luke riding in from the northern trail. The leaves had thinned across the trees, leaving the world exposed and honest, with nothing left to hide behind. It had been nearly 3 months since she returned from May's cabin, 3 months of quiet days spent reclaiming her rhythm, reshaping her space without asking permission. Luke had stayed as he'd promised. He hadn't crowded her, hadn't demanded. He had simply lived beside her, and in that space between them something unspoken had taken root. Now he approached not with the burdened shoulders of a man who owed explanation, but with the calm of someone who had come to offer something that could be refused. She stepped down to meet him before he had even dismounted. He removed his hat, eyes fixed on hers. "I went to Clearwater," he said. "Found the last of the men still holding claim on the debts from Wyoming. Showed them the records, the payments, the truth. It's done." He pulled a small envelope from his coat and handed it to her. Inside were documents, stamped and signed, confirming the closure of accounts, the extinguishing of claims. "Legal, final, binding. I don't need to hide anymore," he said. She held the papers without speaking, fingers tracing the edges, her breath steady. "I came to tell you I'm leaving," Luke continued. "Not because I want to, but because you deserve the choice. You never had one, not really. Not when I arrived, not at the chapel, not the night you tried to go, so I'm giving it to you now." He gestured behind him, toward the trail. "I've packed. I'll ride out before noon, unless you ask me to stay." Evelyn looked at the envelope again, then at him. The air between them was still. Not tense, not fearful, just full. "You've done what you needed to," she said. "I did it for me," he replied. "Not to win anything, but I won't pretend I don't hope you'll ask." She stepped back, holding the papers in both hands. "If I ask you to stay, it won't be as payment for saving my name, or because you were the only one who didn't look away. I know. And it won't be because the town expects it. I'm not asking for duty." She nodded, looking toward the field beyond the fence, where the grass had faded to silver and gold, the last touch of summer hiding in shadows. Then she looked back at the house. It washes, still. And it was still standing, still waiting, like her. "I never wanted to be saved," she said. "I know," he whispered. "But I want a partner." Luke's breath caught just once. Then he nodded. She turned, walked back up the porch and opened the front door. Held it. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a declaration. But it was a choice. Luke tied his horse, climbed the steps, and crossed the threshold without speaking. He removed his coat and boots, placed them where they belonged. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, like the end of a chapter, not the beginning of one. Inside, the fire was already lit. Evelyn moved to the stove, poured 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one. They stood across from each other for a moment, then sat. This time, when the silence settled between them, it didn't need to be broken. It didn't carry the weight of past mistakes or future fears. It just was. The house did not feel crowded. It felt full. And for the first time, Evelyn Carter was not waiting for the world to make a decision about her. She had made her own. With him. Not for him, not against him, with him. The choice had been hers. Finally, fully, and it was enough.